Livy. Capping off Book 38. Section 56. There are many other conflicting stories in the tradition that focus especially on the latter days of Scipio, his trial, death, funeral, and tomb, so that I cannot decide on which anecdotal or literary account to accept. There is no agreement on who it was that accused him. Some authors say that Marcus Naevius arraigned him, others the Petilii. No agreement, again, on the date of his arraignment, the year of his death, or the location of his death and funeral. Some say he died and was buried at Rome, others at Liternum. Cenotaphs and statues are to be seen in both places. There was, at Liternum, a cenotaph with a statue set upon it, and this statue, which has been shattered by a storm, I recently saw for myself. There are also, at Rome, 3 statues on the cenotaph of the Scipios outside the Porto Capena, and 2 of these are said to be those of Publius and Lucius Scipio, the third that of the poet Quintus Ennius. The discrepancy in accounts is not confined to historians either. The speeches of Publius Scipio and Tiberius Gracchus, provided that those which are in circulation are authentic, are also at variance with each other. The title tag of Publius Scipio's oration contains the name of Marcus Naevius, the plebeian tribune, but the oration itself lacks the name of Scipio's accuser, referring only to the reprobate, or elsewhere, the dilettante. Even the speech of Gracchus makes no mention of the Petilii as prosecutors of Africanus, or of his arraignment. A completely new scenario needs to be established that accords with Gracchus's speech, and we must follow those authors who report that Africanus was a member of a diplomatic mission in Etruria at the time that Lucius Scipio was accused and found guilty of taking money from the king. According to them, here, Africanus abandoned the delegation after news was brought of his brother's misfortunes, and hastened to Rome. Apprised that his brother was being imprisoned, he went straight from the city gate to the forum, pushed the attending officer from his brother, and, when the tribune tried to hold him back, assaulted them, with more thought for family loyalty than his role as a citizen. This behavior is precisely what forms the substance of Tiberius Gracchus's complaint, the power of the tribunes being violated by a private citizen. And eventually, when he promises his assistance to Lucius Scipio, Gracchus adds that to give the impression that the tribunician power and the whole state have been undermined by a tribune of the people rather than by a private individual was a more acceptable precedent. But Gracchus's vituperation of Scipio's single instance of uncontrolled violence is done in such a way that, in reproaching him for having so fallen short of his own standards, he compensates for his immediate criticism by augmenting the praise heaped upon him in the past for his restraint and self-discipline. For he states that the people were reprimanded by Scipio for wishing to make him consul and dictator without term, that he forbade statues to be set upon to him in the comitum, on the rostra, in the Senate House, on the Capitol, and in the shrine of Jupiter, and that he opposed a decree authorizing a portrait of him, exciting from the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, dressed for the triumph. 57. Even set in a eulogy, such statements would bear witness to a tremendous greatness of spirit, which restricted honors to constitutional norms, and they were uttered by an opponent in the course of criticism. It was to this Gracchus, it is generally agreed, that the younger of Scipio's two daughters was married. The elder was certainly betrothed by her father to Publius Cornelius Nasica. What is not so sure is whether the girl was betrothed and married to him after her father's death, or whether the well-known anecdotes on the matter are true. According to these, when Lucius Scipio was being taken to prison, and none of Gracchus's colleagues came to his aid, Gracchus swore that his earlier feud with the Scipios was still alive, and his actions were not designed to curry favor with them, but that he would not have the brother of Africanus taken to that prison into which he had seen Africanus take enemy potentates and commanders. The story continues that the Senate happened to be dining on the Capitol that day, and that the members rose up together and requested that Africanus betroth his daughter to Gracchus during the dinner. The betrothal thus took place at this public occasion, and when Scipio went home, he told his wife, Aemilia, that he had arranged the engagement of their younger daughter. Aemilia, just like a woman, was angry at his complete lack of consultation about a daughter who belonged to them both, and went on to say that the girl's mother should not have been left out of the decision, even it were Tiberius Gracchus to whom he was betrothing her. Scipio was reportedly delighted with the correspondence of their opinions, and replied that this was the very man to whom she was engaged. In view of the stature of the man, it was incumbent on me to report these differing versions in the anecdotal accounts as well as the literary records. 58. At the conclusion of the trials, which were presided over by the praetor Quintus Terentius, Hostilius, and Furius, were found guilty, and on that same day they gave the urban praetors their sureties. Scipio, however, insisted that all the money he had received was in the treasury, and that he was in the possession of no public funds, whereupon imprisonment proceedings were begun. Publius Scipio Nasica appealed to the tribunes and delivered a speech filled with valid tributes, not just to the Cornelian gens as a whole, but to his branch of it in particular. His own father, and the father of Publius Africanus and Lucius Scipio, the man now being imprisoned, had been Gnaeus and Publius Scipio, men of great distinction, he said. These had, over a number of years, enhanced the reputation of the Roman people in a struggle against a large number of Punic and Spanish commanders and armies, and not just by their campaigns, but also by giving those peoples an illustration of Roman self-discipline and reliability. Eventually, both had met their end fighting for the state. It would have been enough for their descendants to maintain the glorious reputation of these men, said Nasica. But instead, Publius Africanus had so far eclipsed the exemplary record of his father as to make people believe that his bloodline was not human, but that he was of divine lineage. As for Lucius Scipio, the man now under discussion, one could pass over his achievements in Spain and in Africa as his brother's officer. As consul, he had been considered by the Senate worthy of being assigned the province of Asia and direction of the war with Antiochus, without Sortition, and his brother, who had held 2 consulships and the censorship, and had celebrated a triumph, thought enough of him to accompany him to Asia at his legate. In that province, a fortuitous event saw to it that the grandeur and eminence of the legate did not eclipse the merits of the consul. On the day that Lucius Scipio vanquished Antiochus in pitched battle at Magnesia, Publius Scipio lay sick at Elea, a number of days' journey away. And the army of Antiochus was no smaller than the army of Hannibal, which the Romans had faced in Africa. That same Hannibal, who had been the commander-in-chief in the Punic War, was in fact only one of the king's many officers. The war, too, had been fought in such a way that nobody could even find fault with his luck. It was in the peace treaty that grounds for criticism were sought. This, it is said, was put on sale. On this score, the 10 commissioners are also incriminated, because it was on their advice that the peace was concluded. Some of the 10 commissioners had emerged to accuse Gnaeus Manlius, but that denunciation had not enough weight even to delay his triumph, let alone inspire confidence in the charge. 59. But heavens above, Nasica continued. In Scipio's case, the allegation was that the peace terms themselves looked suspiciously favorable to Antiochus. His kingdom was left untouched. He had, in defeat, everything that he had possessed before the war, and though he had had a large amount of gold and silver, none of it had been made public property, but all of it had gone into private hands. In fact, though, at Lucius Scipio's triumph had not as much gold and silver as in 10 other triumphs put together been carried before the eyes of the whole population. What am I to say about the bounds of Antiochus's kingdom? Nasica continued. Antiochus had held the whole of Asia and the parts of Europe next to it. How much of the world this covers, extending as it did from the Taurus range all the way into the Aegean Sea, the number of peoples, and not just towns it encompasses, everybody is aware of this. This area, which was more than 30 days' journey in length and 10 days in width between the 2 seas, and which extended as far as the heights of the Taurus range, this was taken from Antiochus, who was driven to the farthest corner of the world. What more could have been taken from him if the peace settlement had cost him nothing? The conquered Philip had been left Macedonia, and Nabis had been left Sparta. But no indictment was sought against Quinctius. No, because he had not had Africanus as a brother, a man whose brilliant reputation should have helped Lucius Scipio, who was instead harmed by the jealousy felt for his brother. According to the judgment, as much gold and silver had been taken into Lucius Scipio's home as could not be raised by the sale of all his property. So, where was the king's gold? Where the many legacies Scipio received? A pile of newly acquired wealth should have come to light in a house that expenses had not drained. And of course, Lucius Scipio's enemies were now going to take from his body and his back, by hounding and insulting him, what could not be raised from his property Their aim was to have a man of great distinction locked in a prison amongst thieves of the night and footpads, to have him breathe his last in a dark gale, and then thrown out naked before the prison. That would be less scandalous for the family of the Cornelli than it would for the city of Rome, he concluded. 60. In response, the praetor Terentius read out the bill of the Pitellae, the decree of the Senate, and the verdict passed on Lucius Scipio. Unless the fine imposed by the sentence of the court were paid into the treasury, said Terentius, he had no option but to order the convicted man arrested and taken to prison. A little later, after the tribunes had withdrawn to confer, Gaius Fannius declared that he and all his colleagues, apart from Gracchus, were agreed that the tribunes not veto the praetor in the exercise of his authority. Tiberius Gracchus made the following pronouncement. He did not veto the collection of the fine prescribed by the sentence from the property of Lucius Scipio, he said. But Lucius Scipio was a man who had vanquished the richest king in the world and advanced the rule of Roman people to the farthest limits of the earth. He had put Eumenes, the Rhodians, and many other cities of Asia under obligation through services rendered them by the Roman people. And he had led along in his triumphal procession and then imprisoned a large number of enemy generals. So he, Gracchus, was not going to let Lucius Scipio sit in chains in prison amongst the enemies of the Roman people, he said, and he ordered his release. Gracchus's decree was met with such universal approval, and people were so happy to see Scipio released, that it hardly seemed possible the verdict had been passed in the same community. After this, the praetor sent the quaestors to see to the public confiscation of the property of Lucius Scipio. So far from there being any trace of the king's money, the amount raised was nowhere close to the sum he had been sentenced to pay. So much money was raised for Lucius Scipio by his relatives, friends, and clients that accepting it would have left him richer than he had been before the tragedy struck. But he took nothing. What he needed for basic living was bought back for him by his closest family, and the resentment felt for the Scipios recoiled on the praetor, his board of advisors, and the prosecutors. End of Book 38.